Hi, everybody. Before we just jump into this episode, I just wanted to throw out a quick reminder about the Gospel Fundamentals class that will be taught by Taylor Smith that starts this Thursday, April 3rd. This is a class that's open to everybody: fundamentalists, LDS members, uncorrelated Mormons, or anyone who's not Mormon for that matter. If this is something you're interested in, just click on the link in this episode's show notes and get signed up today.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Dave, what's going on, man?
How you doing? It's been
Good.
quite a deal.
What's that?
I said it's been quite a deal, but we're doing good.
Yeah, good. Work's going good. Staying busy.
Yep. Yep.
Family's all good.
For the most part, as much as they can be, big
Nice.
families.
I hear you. I hear you. So, real quick, just to give everybody some background here, you've been a lifelong Mormon fundamentalist, right?
That's right. Yep.
Born and raised.
Born and raised.
Nice. Nice. So, and if you want, I can edit this part out later, but you are part of the what is commonly referred to as the Nielsen Nailers, right? I know there's a better, more official name, maybe.
Yeah, the better, more official name we usually send to people is the Church and Kingdom.
Okay. Perfect.
But Nielsen Nailers is the more of the online
Gotcha.
understanding, most people.
Gotcha. I always want to be careful there. I
Oh
say
yeah, go ahead.
I say plenty of things that I stick my foot in my mouth for, so I don't want to. I want to offend as few people as possible. But
Yeah.
man, I'm glad to have you on, and it's kind of funny how this worked out. So I knew in this temple series, I knew I had to do one on the law of consecration, and um, I just could not find anybody who I felt really kind of good about asking on this particular subject, and I was kind of starting to get panicked because I was about 2 weeks out from dropping, needing to drop this one, and then like you reached out and we just started talking a little bit, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, I think you asked specifically about consecration. And I'm like, there's my guy right there. So it's funny how all this works out.
Yeah, and I felt bad because I had felt like reaching out to you as soon as I saw the first one you dropped with the law of obedience. And I thought I need to reach out to him because I had been thinking about consecration and its effects on our lives and how it's something that's often talked about, but not really uh, well, it's talked like we're gonna live this one day, or maybe we're doing it in our heart. And so I started studying it some time ago, and then I saw your thing pop up, and I thought, oh, well, I wonder who he has doing that. And then I thought, well, I don't want to put myself out there, but then I was sitting in the Denver airport, and something hit me really hard, and it said, just text him. So I did, and then you said, call me. And so we had this good conversation. So I
Yeah.
think it was maybe supposed to be.
That this happens more frequently than people would imagine. I mean, just in this series alone, when I interviewed Seth Lobb about the law of sacrifice, because look, I make a lot of these, almost all of them, well, pretty much all of them, a matter of prayer, right? Where I'll
Mhm.
just try to figure out who's best to bring on. And Seth's name came to me, and I called Seth, and it's like, hey man, you want to come on and talk about this? He's like, it's funny you should bring that up because I was just studying on this and felt like I should. So that's for everybody else out there who, if you feel like, gosh, maybe I should give a talk on this or something, reach out to me. Chances are it's something that I may be thinking about, and if not, I probably should be thinking about. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're feeling prompted, anybody out there, give me a call. We'll get you on and get it moving. But so today's
Great.
consecration's a big one.
Yeah, there's a lot of history involved here. And there's a lot we can talk about in relation to the doctrine and what's contained in the temple and how it applies. I think we'll have a good conversation.
Awesome. And now we want to start in the history, right?
That's always a good place, because if we understand where something comes from and what it was instituted for, we might be able to better place it into our life in the appropriate place.
Right. It's funny. And I know I've used this analogy on here before, but as a land surveyor, one of the things I remember studying when I was in college a lot was what was called latitudes and departures, right? And so basically it's kind of a rule, right? Which is, okay, if you're off a second of a degree, well, you're not going to see it in, you know, a tenth of a foot. You're not going to really see it in half a foot. You probably really wouldn't see it in, like, I don't know, 500 feet. But you start stretching out over a mile or a couple of miles. Well, now all of a sudden you are a long ways off your target, right? And so I couldn't agree with you more that if you know where you're starting from and you get that right, then everything can flow from there. And Joseph Smith
Yeah,
said something similar, right? It's easier to go right if you start right. And I
yeah.
think that that's hugely important. So take it away, man.
Okay. So let's start way, way back in the beginning, 1830s.
Okay.
And here's Joseph Smith. The church had just been organized. And one of the first commandments he gives, or the Lord gives him, is to start retranslating the Bible.
Hmm.
Sidney Rigdon gets converted during this time, and he's named his translator. He's going to help him. So they start going through the Bible, and Joseph receives the revelation, which today we know as Moses, the Book of Moses, and the Pearl of Great Price. And as they start moving through this Book of Moses, they come to a man named Enoch in the Book of Moses, Moses chapter 6, chapter 7. And now, from a Mormon's perspective, looking backwards, we know that Enoch was very involved with this idea of all things in common, and so here you have Sidney Rigdon. I want to start out with him. So he is a Baptist preacher before he's a Mormon. He follows after the teachings of the Campbellites,
Hmm.
but he separates from the Campbellites because they, the Campbells, just real short, because this is just actually kind of important. The Campbell, I can't remember his name, but somebody Campbell, he was trying to do a restoration of the New Testament church. Sidney
Hmm.
Rigdon felt very strongly that there should be this communal organization, like what was contained in Acts chapter 4, where it says that the disciples had all things in common. It says that It says, neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the prices of the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet. So there's this, the beginnings is in the New Testament. Like most of the restoration things, they start in the Bible, and the
Right.
prophet begins to ask questions. Well, what's interesting is here you have Sidney Rigdon, who really believed in this. This is about basically the only place in the New Testament that really mentions this. There's one place in the Old Testament that we'll talk about a little later. But so here he starts this communal family, Sidney Rigdon does, before he's a member of the church. And then he meets the missionaries, and he reads the Book of Mormon, he gets converted. He's a great spokesperson, and Joseph puts him right to work. Well, they come across this Enoch, and there's a common phrase between Acts and Enoch. In Acts, it says, and the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and one soul. Now, what it says about Enoch and his people in Moses 7:18, and the Lord called his people Zion, because they were of one heart and one mind, and dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. So, this, I'm just imagining, and this is the book of David, so take it whatever it means. I'm imagining that Sidney Rigdon goes, hey, there's something in common here. One
Mm.
heart, one mind, one heart, one soul. And Enoch was able to get the Lord to come and dwell with them, and the city of Enoch was taken up and was not. So this is important.
Right.
And so no doubt him and Joseph had this conversation. Now, this is like December of 1830. Joseph receives a revelation, section 37, and the Lord tells him to cease translating. Don't translate the Bible anymore. Gather to the Ohio, it says.
Right.
And then in January, he receives another revelation, section 38, which says, gather to the Ohio, and there I will reveal unto you my law.
Hmm.
So, so there's this purpose. And he also says he'll endow them with power from on high. But, and so that's where we start tying this into the temple a little bit more. But so here in January, they receive this revelation. February 4th, they make it to Kirtland. On Kirtland, there is a group of people living on, and I think this may have been people that knew Sidney Rigdon from before, but there's a group of people down there that is in the John Whitmer history, in the book of, or in the Joseph Smith papers, mentions this. And it says that on the Isaac Morley farm, they lived as a communal family there. And also another one in Mayfield that did the same thing. There's about 100 people that were living communally
Wow.
and based solely off those few verses in Acts chapter 4. They were living it and they were doing their best. But John Whitmer says something interesting because uh, he says, Prophet and Sidney Rigdon arrives at Kirtland to the joy and satisfaction of the saints. The disciples there had all things common and were going to destruction very fast as to temporal things.
Wow.
And he says the reason why is because they believe from the scripture that what belonged to one man belonged to another. And they would take each other's clothes and property and use it without leave, which brought on confusion and disappointments, for they did not understand the scripture. Joseph lived here a few days, and the word of the Lord came, saying, so he'd been there for 5 days, and he gathers the elders together, and he receives Doctrine and Covenants, section 42. This is the law. So there you have the context of the history leading up to how Joseph asked these questions. Why? How do we do this properly? Because they're seeing this being done, they're having this question, but it's just a mess. We even have another story in Kirtland of one of the brethren at a meeting, if I remember the story right. I don't have it in my notes. And one of these men came that believed this communal living and came and took his watch right off of him. And then the brother was fairly concerned, and I guess went and talked to him a few days later and said, "Hey, you took my watch," because he believed all things were in common. And this brother says, "Yeah, well, I sold it." So,
Whoa. Yeah, I
and
don't I'm not an expert on it, but I don't think it's supposed to go that way, right? Like
right,
it and I'm also glad we're having this because so often people look at the law of consecration and you get in a united order and that sort of stuff and it gets presented almost like, oh, well, it's just socialism with a religious bent, right?
right,
But I would say be very careful of flirting with that because that is
right,
not what this is, right? And I think that'll
right.
get pointed out later on. But keep
Well, we're going to
keep in
talk about
mind.
that right now because
Okay.
this is the beginning words in DNC 42, verse 30, where it first starts talking about this. Behold, this is DNC 42:30. And behold, thou wilt remember the poor and consecrate of thy properties for their support, that which thou hast to impart unto them with a covenant and a deed that cannot be broken.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first verse. So you already have this being set up as the purpose is to take care of the poor. And people are going to consecrate their properties in this way. But there's a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken. And I believe the wording is such that that goes both ways.
Right.
Now, maybe in the beginning they didn't understand this because they had a lot of learning to do.
Right.
It wasn't always this way, but they started this way. So the Lord reveals this important revelation, and there's several verses, which I don't just want to read scriptures,
Sure. Yeah.
but there's several verses here where it starts to lay out how this is to be done. You're supposed to take the things you own, present them to the bishop, and the bishop, you make this official consecration. The bishop takes it, writes it all down, and then in most cases gives you back what you consecrated. And I mean, we're talking, we have consecration records of right down to tools and shoes and, not just property, but everything they owned.
Right.
But it was mostly just given right back as a stewardship, but with a covenant and a deed, which cannot be broken, which is the way it was supposed to be.
Interesting. Did you ever, in any of the records you've seen, did you ever see any of those deeds or those covenants?
I didn't see them with my eyes, but I know that they're in the Joseph Smith Papers project
Okay.
because some of the podcasts I listened to, which there's a really great one, and maybe if you don't mind, I'll call it
No,
out here
go
because
go
it's
ahead.
good.
Yeah, no. Absolutely.
uh, Church History Matters
Okay.
podcast. They have like a 4-part series on the law of consecration, and they're they're using it. The history is really good. They use it to kind of justify the church's position today,
Sure.
which might be, offensive to some, but nonetheless, the history they give is really good. So they talk about these deeds being in the Joseph Smith Papers, where you can see a record kept of this thing that happened. Now, I want to keep talking about this covenant and deed because there's something else that happens. So I mentioned Isaac Morley and his farm. He had communal living on his farm. Well, after Joseph reveals this revelation, if I'm remembering the story, he kind of gets a little disaffected at some point,
Right.
and he wants his farm back. But he has all these people living like a communal family on this farm, and he just kicks them off and then proceeds to fine them for damages they did while improving his farm. So
Oh,
you immediately start to see that Joseph, I'm sure, is sitting here going, okay, how do we do this so that everyone's rights are being respected?
right.
Because people are consecrating and then now they can take back their consecration. Can they?
Right.
You know, you're a Mormon or you're an American history buff.
Yep.
You know that property rights and property ownership was a huge deal after especially after the beginning of our country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was the thing that really started to separate America from the rest of the world, right? Because
Right.
the rest of the world, even today, to a certain degree, is still involved in a lot of serfdom in one form or another, right?
Right.
Property ownership isn't necessarily a big thing in the UK or in anywhere in Europe, right? Because
Right.
it's been in the hands of what were lords for centuries, and then it gets bequeathed through deed later down. But also, if it's your land and it can't be taken away, that gives you a sense of stability that the rest of the world just didn't offer. It was instrumental in making America what it is today.
Yeah. And so with that in mind going forward here, they're talking about consecrating their properties,
Hmm.
not just their tools and their things, but really you're talking about an agrarian society here after the War of Independence. You're not that long, right?
No,
And this is mostly an agrarian society. Their land is their life. This is where they grow their food, everything.
they are subsistence farmers, right? I mean,
Right. That's right.
until consecration comes around for a lot of these people, the goal is that you got enough of everything to feed your family through the winter. And then if you had a good harvest, you had some that then you could take to market, right? But
Right.
you were feeding yourself and your family first and taking the excess to sell at market. And
Yep.
so it's got to be problematic, right? And we'll use Isaac Morley as an example, as you just said, because Morley makes this commitment that, hey, I'm going to do this, right? So you probably have other subsistence farmers that have now been allotted a piece of ground through the system, and they are literally dependent upon that land to eat and live on, and now that's gone. And so now you've increased the number of poor, right? You haven't necessarily decreased it. So yeah, it would have had to have broke Joseph's heart to see it go down that way.
Right. And so you have this very clear revelation that once those properties are consecrated to the church, it's verse 32, They cannot be taken from the church. So they're given there. Now there's a stewardship that's appointed back, and that stewardship becomes in essence deeded to you based on these revelations. There's several of them that they received in the next few years to kind of clarify this. I'm reminded of a story, if I can remember the details, of Lehman Copley. He's probably not as well known for this story as he is in the pro polygamy arguments, because he said that he had some evidence of it. But anyway, he's here at this time. Well, he gets disaffected with the church and leads, but he wants his property back. But the agreement that they come to is the part that he consecrated to the church is the church's, but
Right.
the part that was deeded back as a stewardship to him, that's his. And there's a revelation, and I probably have it here, but essentially I remember the context of it, which is that's his, and nobody can take it away from him.
Right.
So one of the questions that I had in relation to this is, so you have this property, it's been consecrated to the church. It's the church has taken part of it, perhaps, for the benefit of others if you have surplus. And then you have the part that's yours for in based on the word of the Lord. The reason you would do this is because it becomes an eternal inheritance to you.
Right.
Because you've turned it over, you've recognized the true master of the property. And I really think this was a profound idea to the people of the day, because we're going to turn our property over, the bishop's going to give it back, but we will get this forever. This is our eternal inheritance, like Israel, the land of Israel was
Right.
to the Hebrews, and then this earth, everything in the earth is the Lord's, and we're getting to become an heir with Jesus Christ in this.
Right.
And there's something deeper that's going on here. The Lord is trying to use these temporal things to help us understand a spiritual nature of it. So we can keep that in mind as we keep going through the history, because really it's about overcoming greed and material possessionism. This is taking care of the poor and recognizing the needs for these properties to go where they're needed, and we're going to talk about surplus, because something very interesting starts to happen here. The law of consecration has been established, this order. People in Kirtland are doing it, but there's still some problems that keep coming up. Well, the Lord tells them to build the temple,
Mm-hmm.
and they push forward. And we all know the story. The Kirtland Temple was the most expensive building ever built by the poorest people,
Yep.
and all this magnificent story. Well, what happens is, in order to build the Kirtland Temple, they go into massive debt,
Right.
because it's all about getting it done. And this is good, but it's good debt in one sense, because they're pushing forward. They get this endowment of power, which was promised in Section
Yep.
38, along with this. And then that's when the problems begin to happen, as we know the history. The Kirtland Safety Society is started as a type of bank or anti-bank based on the history, but it's kept in mind of this law of consecration. This
Right.
is how the church is going to repay this debt. This is how the saints are going to come to prosperity, and it falls apart. I mean, there's a national banking collapse in the United States around that time.
Yes.
I think they say somewhere around like maybe 40% of the banks in America closed.
Absolutely. This was not something, and I'm glad you brought this up because I think this is important, right? Because I have heard this spun as a way of beating up on Joseph Smith. It's often painted as, gosh, how could Joseph be a prophet, right? Because he led all these people into this, the Kirtland Safety Society, and then next thing you know, there's, everybody's poor again because everyone lost a lot of money, right? But it's important to realize that this was a national crisis. This was not something that was isolated just to the Kirtland Safety Society. you just like you said, 40% of all banks were failing in this moment, right? And the
Yeah.
thing that we know about economy is that it kind of works like physics or biology, kind of both, right? Is that within economy, especially within a capitalistic economy, everybody gets exposed, right? There is an idea of contagion, right? And a kind of a
Yep.
domino effect. If because banks did business all the time, still do, money back and forth to each other. And so
Right.
when one goes down, it doesn't take long before everybody feels it. And then the other thing I'll say is that, there were some pretty shady practices going on with money supply and those sorts of things. So to put this on Joseph's shoulders, I don't think holds water whatsoever. I think you are dealing
Yep.
with a national crisis, not just a crisis in Kirtland.
Right. And the proof of that is really, if you're going to put this on anybody's shoulders, you can put it on Andrew Jackson's shoulders
Yes.
because he dissolved the Bank of America, which may have been the right thing to do, but it created this collapse. And, you know, back then, it wasn't like it is today. Today, we have one bank over that's partnered with America, the Federal Reserve. We all use Federal Reserve notes. Back then, every bank had their own notes.
Yep.
And so the Kirtland Safety Society notes, which the reason they called it the anti-bank is because the state of Ohio would not grant them a charter.
Right.
So they had to come up with a way around that. But they had their own notes, and there were several things that happened to at this time. So the banks around them are failing. One thing that I would say, Prophet Joseph told the people, hey, if we do this and we do it faithfully, the Lord will bless us and this will be successful. Well, there was some of the major investors that were supposed to pay in the bank to make it happen. They were late on their payments. They weren't paying. The prophet was putting more of his own money into it. And then there was antagonists who hated the church that were just, I think, the next town over. And I can't remember the man's name, but he came over and he started buying up Kirtland safety notes and then did a run on the bank a couple of times. Like, I mean, this is, what's the Christmas show with James Stewart?
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life, just like they did the run on the bank there. So they did this run on the bank with the Kirtland Safety Society just to downfall it. And so there was too many factors going on for this thing to be successful.
Well, and even
Wow.
sabotage, right? I hadn't heard that,
Right.
right? The
Yep.
sabotage. That's something
Yep.
different. And
Yep.
before somebody comes at me with, well, gosh, Joseph Smith was supposed to be a prophet. Why didn't he, see that coming? Just relax, right? There's been a lot of guys in the scriptures who've been duped by other people, right?
Right.
So,
And as we know, the promises of God are almost always accompanied by faithful adherence to his commandments.
absolutely.
So anyway, this happens. Now, certain safety society crashes. Joseph and the other faithful brethren are being, basically threatened for their lives. And the faithful of them go to the west because of a revelation to Far West and Missouri,
Hmm.
Far West and Independence. Well, Joseph now has had a whole bunch of experience that he didn't have before. And he goes to the Lord and says, okay, how are we supposed to do this? Because the Lord's now commanded them to build a new temple in Far West and in Independence and told them they were not supposed to go into debt to do this, which,
Tricky.
well, this is like, yeah, well, I mean, they just did this temple and they couldn't do it without going into debt. So
Right.
now how are they supposed to do this? And he asked the Lord, and the Lord gives him section 119 in 1838 now. So it's been several years. They've been trying this. And it's just interesting because in the LDS church, they say in the heading for this revelation, this is where the law of consecration was done away with because of unfaithfulness, and the law of tithing replaced it. But I just say, let's read the revelation and see what the Lord really says, because is he
Yeah.
saying consecration's done away with? It's a short revelation, section 119. Verily, thus saith the Lord, I require all their surplus property to be put in the hands of the bishop of my church in Zion, for the building of mine house, and for the laying of the foundation of Zion, and for the priesthood, and for the debts of the presidency of my church. And this shall be the beginning of the tithing of my people. And after that, those who have thus been tithed shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually, and this shall be a standing law unto them forever, for my holy priesthood, saith the Lord. And then it goes on a little bit more, just a few more verses, but oh, I didn't want to leave this out. And I say unto you, if my people observe not this law to keep it holy, and by this law sanctify the land of Zion unto me, that my statutes and my judgments may be kept thereon, that it might be most holy. Behold, verily I say unto you, it shall not be a land of Zion unto you. And this shall be an ensample unto all the stakes of Zion, even sowing it.
Hmm.
So this is the law of tithing revelation, but it doesn't say do away with consecration and do tithing only. It says you're still required to put all your surplus property in the hands of the bishop, just like before.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it
It's
doesn't.
almost the same.
Yeah. It doesn't rescind, as you showed earlier, where the command was, you're going to have your plot of land. You'll take what you need for yourself, and then the surplus goes back to the bishop, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
then this next one, it goes out of its way. The Lord goes out of his way to mention you still got to do this thing with the surplus, right? This is still
Yeah,
enforced, and then there is tithing, right? And so to say that, oh, now we stop, stop law of consecration, united order kind of stuff, and we're just going to tithing, it's kind of a stretch,
it's not scriptural.
right?
And so and not to bash on my friends in the church because I have a lot of them, but just paying tithing on 10% of your income is not fulfilling the commandment the Lord gave.
Right,
And we can go into why that's a problem because there's this when we go into the temple, we make this covenant, which we're going to talk about. And it has more to do with than just saying, okay, well, 90% of everything I make is mine and 10% is the Lord's.
right.
That's not what he's saying he wants us to do. He wants us to recognize that everything we have, we should use for this purpose. So, but the surplus property specifically, so if we have extra property and the way that they understood this at the time was property that wasn't being used. If
Okay,
you're in an agrarian society and your land is how you feed your family and make your living, and somebody has land that isn't being used,
right.
then why not give it to somebody so that they can use it and the poor can be taken care of as well? So you see that this is real wisdom. Now,
Dave, can I
I
point
know,
something out? I'm sorry, I
go
don't want
ahead.
to derail
No,
you, but something just
hey,
hit
it's
me.
good.
Excuse me. I want to point this out because I find this interesting. The Lord in his program is like, okay, how do we take care of the poor? Well, if there's excess lands to be had, let's put people on that land to cultivate it, and they can start providing for themselves and maybe even extra to help out someone else who's poor. If we go back and we look in Old Testament times, especially when Israel starts getting into the worship of Baal, one of the things that's interesting about offerings that would be made to Baal is that you would turn your fields back feral. You just let it go, right? That
Mhm.
was the offering that was supposed to initiate this sacrifice to Baal that he would then bless your other crops with more, right? And so I find it very interesting that there is this thread that seems to be running between what God wants and then Lucifer decides he's going to come along and he's going to put a twist on it, right?
Yep.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's a great story, and let's remember that because this is in direct opposition to what we're told in the temple. And we'll talk about this when we kind of get through the history because there's something very important with that story. So
Okay.
that's a great story. So uh Okay, so back into the history. So they start doing this, and we can talk about if we want to. I know you've done other podcasts on tithing. And I'm not going to tell people what their tithing should be, but this is an interesting phrase because we always hear it the other way. At least I always have.
Right.
We're supposed to be tithed of our increase.
Right.
But is that phrase in the scriptures? Because I couldn't find it. Now, maybe it is, and somebody, if it is, then we can be corrected. But I couldn't find it said exactly like that.
Okay. What did you
So
find?
this one right here in verse 4 is the main one that I found. Those who have been tithed shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually. And
Okay.
they take the word interest and they say that means increase or that means income. And we can go into all the details of what they understood it to mean, which was different.
Okay.
They so the way that it was back then, at least based on what I've done the last week studying this, because it's very interesting, is they would they would do like a profit and loss. So you would like with your business, and you
Right.
take all your debts and you take all your income and you compare the two, you chop off your debt, then you would have your profit. And then in the early days of the country, they had the interest on your profit, which was the interest rates were pretty stable at 6%. Of course, they didn't have like the Federal Reserve to manage it. Everyone just knew. So of that 6%, like your that was considered your interest
Okay.
of what you were worth.
Not necessarily
One
your profit, but the interest on the
of
profit.
Yeah, of what you were worth.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So you're so 10 a tenth of your interest annually. So 6% of your profit, and then they tied that part. So you're talking a very little amount.
Yeah.
Later, later they did clarify, and I think Quorum of the 12 put out a letter saying this is probably better to be 1/10 of your income,
Gotcha.
especially as they start shifting from an agrarian society to, where money becomes much more common. I mean, by the time Brigham comes around, Joseph is killed, then money becomes the source. And they have people doing all kinds of jobs for money to buy things from farmers. And this is where the capitalist society, or there's another word for the development, uh, anyway, it's something to do with word just escapes me. Um, Production society, like where you have people in factories and all this starts to come about, especially in
The
England
Industrial
and in Europe.
Revolution.
There we go. Yep,
Okay.
the Industrial Revolution starts to happen. Now things shift from an agrarian society to a money-based society.
Gotcha.
And that's when the change is more or less kind of enforced. Okay, this really needs to be 10% of your income or your increase on your income.
Okay.
So that's I thought that was a little interesting bit of history, how that transformed. And it has to do with the dynamics of the day.
Let me ask you
You
this.
know,
Is there anything that you can look at and point to see that maybe the Lord changes that to 10% of your increase, I guess, or does it stay right there?
well, in Deuteronomy, it says that the farmers, when they bring in their grain, should give 1/10 of all their seed,
Okay.
and that's to be used to feed the poor. So
Okay, so there is scriptural precedent for
there
that.
is some scriptural preference. I mean, it's about grain, and it makes perfect sense because you're actually tithing food at that
Right.
point. But in our modern day world, 10% of your income is not I would say it's not an inappropriate way to look at it.
Right.
Although you could look at it historically and say that's not exactly what he meant. But then again, you're paying your tithing. Now, one thing that I kind of have a little burr under my saddle is I believe that the tithing should be done by our conscience as well. Like we
Right.
know
I do
what we
too.
made.
I do too.
I I have a little bit of a problem with a tithing settlement
Mm-hmm.
where you go in, and if it's not deemed that you paid enough, then your recommend will be yanked. I just growing up in a fundamental society, that seems a little strange to me. Now,
Yeah.
others in the church, that might be perfectly normal, and that's okay for them. But for me, I would just be very uncomfortable with that. I
Sure.
would just as soon pay tithing on, I want to be honest. I want to pay an honest tithe, and that's between me and the Lord as far as I'm concerned.
Yep. Yep.
So, uh, but the point of going into all this tithing is tithing does not take away from the law of consecration.
Right.
This is perhaps another way for the temporal salvation of the church. It says right here to build the temple. The temple should be built upon the tithings of the people, and for the debts of the presidency of my church. And even back in section 42, it mentions that the surplus property and the money that the church gathers should be for the building of houses of worship and the purchasing of lands for the church, and all this as the high council and the bishop shall come together on.
Gotcha.
So the church has a need for money, has a need for this ability to bless the poor and provide things for its members like meeting houses, and that needs to be done as a separate organization from the people. Like fundamentalists everywhere have had this problem where we will build our meeting houses and they'll be in the name of the person's house that they're holding in.
Right.
And then there gets to be a problem because it's understood that if the church owns it, then the members of the church are really the owners. And
Right.
this is still alive in most of your churches today. This is kind of how we understand it. And so to be clean as a church, it would be good to have a separation. You don't
Yep.
want somebody owning the temple as, for instance, as a personal person. It would be better for it to be in a separate organization.
And I've heard a lot of fundamentalists take Heber J. Grant to task over that because if I'm not mistaken, I believe at one point the temple was actually in his name, right?
Ooh.
When he was doing some financing stuff, right? Now I think it was deeded back. I want to be clear about that. I don't
Mhm.
think he was trying to, take the temple for himself necessarily. However, we tend to beat him up over that, right? So if we're gonna swing on him on that, right? And look, I want to be clear. There's a lot you can swing on Heber J. Grant for, right? Like,
Yeah,
I've often said one day I'll write the 5 stages of becoming a fundamentalist, and one of those is that first you're going to have a white hot seething hate for Wilford Woodruff. That will fade as you do more research, but then you'll get to Heber J. Grant, and he'll fill that spot for you. So I'm
that's
I'm
right.
I'm perfectly I get it, right? But if we're going to swing on him for that, we better make sure our own house is in order before we do that.
And also understand that, and this, I'm going to be in defense of Brother Grant here. Remember, and we're going to talk about this because this ties into it. The Edmunds Tucker Act disincorporated the
Yeah.
church.
Yep.
And so they put a lot of things in personal people's names out of fear that the government would take them. So there's a possibility, and I'm not saying this is the
Yeah.
reason, there's a possibility that that was carried over,
Sure.
and that's why it was that way. So there's a little, swing in his defense, but
Yeah.
but I also don't have a lot of confidence in Hubert J. Grant either. Okay, so let's move into the pioneer period
Okay.
because the consecration we know was carried through. Let's just say into Nauvoo. We have in the Joseph Smith Papers project, we do have people still consecrating things during Nauvoo, although perhaps it wasn't made as big a deal. It was kind of, tithing became more standardized, and they built the Nauvoo temple off the tithes and the consecrations of the people, but it was still happening. People were still going into the bishop, they were still consecrating some of their things. And then Joseph's killed,
Right.
and the saints go across the plains.
Okay, before we go there, you did find record where people were still consecrating in Nauvoo.
Yeah, there's records, some of the bishops' records. Now, again, this comes from scholars that I was listening to where they said we found this in the Joseph Smith Papers project. It would be great to dive in and see some of these for
No,
ourselves.
no, I don't have a reason to disbelieve them.
Yeah,
It's just I've kind of wondered about that from time to time because
yeah.
you don't hear about a lot of consecration or united order during the Nauvoo period. And when me and my family went to Nauvoo here just a few years back, I asked somebody about that, one of the missionaries that staffed the
Hmm.
place, and they didn't know anything about it, if that happened or did not. So I was just curious. That was my own edification.
I think that that's probably less common but there were still people who were reading the Book of Commandments, and they still
Right.
had access to this, and were probably trying to comply. That's the way I took it. It wasn't a great, like a huge push in Nauvoo, but it was still there. And from the podcast that I was listening to, they said they found some records of these kind of surplus properties being turned in. So
Interesting.
there was evidence, although it might have been scarce.
Gotcha. Okay.
So they start crossing the plains, and now they come out to Utah. This isn't really pushed. I mean, they have communal type projects. They have different things. Now they're still doing temple ordinances. The law of consecration is part of those. They
Mm-hmm.
they build the endowment house in the 1850s,
Mm-hmm.
and they start doing the endowments again there. And now it might be good at this point, as far as we have any records, to read part of the covenant that we make. I don't think we're out of line to
No, I don't
to
think so.
read some of that. So I've read lots of different endowments, and they're all pretty similar in this specific one. Uh, okay, in that you do consecrate yourself, your time, talents, and everything with which the Lord has blessed you, or with which he may bless you for the building up of the kingdom of God on the earth and for the establishment of Zion. So there we have the basis for the law of consecration is contained in the temple. And they would have given something, if not this exact wording, something very similar throughout the Utah period. So
Right.
this was on people's minds.
Yep.
But it really doesn't become a major push until the 1870s. Brigham's starting to get older. The saints are starting to spread out across the land, and he makes this kind of proclamation, and I think it was 1875, maybe 1874.
Just
And
a few years
he's
before he dies.
right, just a few years, and he says we need to comply with the law of consecration as contained in the Doctrine and Covenants. And I think that, I mean, the saints took right to it. And from the records that I could find, there was something like 150 United Orders across the
Right.
territory, and they varied in methodology. Like, he didn't say they all have to be just like this, they all have to be just like this. They varied based on, some were co-ops like Brigham City and Provo. They were more co-op in nature. And then, of course, you get out to the famous Orderville or Kanab or those kind of places, and they were communal living.
Right.
There's one thing that I kind of noticed in common is where they were in a city and the people were richer, they were co-ops. Where the people were poorer, they were communal living.
Fascinating. And okay, now I'm going to say some stuff, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here. And I
Go
know
ahead.
that, look, for anybody's ancestors who were out there, I'm not criticizing your ancestors. Okay. I look, this is just what happens when people have to experiment with things. And I do want to be clear that while there is instruction on how to consecrate, there isn't a whole lot of commandments or scriptures on how to live a united order, right? How you're going to institute consecration, right?
Right.
You also have to understand that it's not easy getting a message from Kanab, Utah in the 1870s up to Brigham to get some questions answered. Things take time.
Yep.
Okay. But those ones down south there, Kanab, Orderville, they do kind of tend to resemble more of a like you said, a communal experiment or even quasi-socialist, right? And when
Mhm.
you said that the ones that did well were more kind of capitalistic in nature. And I want to point that out because I'm not saying those folks were bad. They were doing the best they could with not having a lot of direction, right? And in some ways, I think it was absolutely worthwhile because we could compare and contrast and then say what worked, what didn't, and why. And so I think it's important that we point that out, that those basic principles still seem to carry over even into consecration and united order.
Yeah. Now, in Orderville's defense, I will say one thing about them, because Orderville it's put on the pedestal, right? It
Right.
is the quintessential. United Order project. I mean, you have these people that come together. I have my own personal concerns with some of the ways that they did things, but they were Orderville was successful
Right.
monetarily. I mean, it was, they I think according to my notes here, uh 80 families come together in Orderville. And when they first combine all their stuff, they have about $21,551 worth of value. And in 4 years, they jumped to almost 70,000.
Holy cow.
And then in 1883, they're up to over 80. So they're and back then in those days, they were very wealthy. They were rivaling Brigham City in terms of value, monetary value. Um, and so they were very successful. Now, but these people were poor when they got there. 80 poor families come together. They have a communal dining hall.
Wow.
They eat all their meals together. The bishop's more or less the father of the community, which starts to infringe a little bit upon patriarchal order in my
Hmm.
mind.
Yep.
Like I'd rather have the fathers be the fathers rather than the bishop be the father.
Right.
But not to worry, the dining hall gets flooded and destroyed at some point, so they kind of break away from that. But you have Lorenzo Snow, and he's in charge of the Brigham City Co-op,
Hmm.
and it's doing fantastic. But they're looser than a communal living. They're still retain some capitalistic tendencies, and they're kind of coming together to bless the poor and increase this co-op. And Lorenzo Snow's a powerhouse behind
Hmm.
this. I mean, everything I read, he is an animal. Now, his I think it's his brother, Erastus Snow, was he was from the South, like he lived down in the South. And Erastus Snow in 1883, he recommended moving the wages because the way they did wages in Orderville was it was very equal, regardless of the work you did. Everyone got the same amount. They just did what they did for a living. But he recommended removing that and giving more freedom to people. But and that just started the process of moving away from this extreme communal, uh, you know, order, if you will, of Orderville. Now, I want to make mention of something because this is really interesting. So we've heard about Orderville, and the Orderville's just tight. There was many others like we're talking,
Right.
and we all say, well, they all failed. Well, why did they fail?
Right.
Because some of them failed. Like I remember a story. I think it was Joseph Young.
Okay.
Maybe it was one of the Youngs anyway. One of Brigham Young's sons was in Provo, and they were trying to establish the order there. And he voluntarily withdrew from the order. And according to his quote was, "I left the order because there was no order in it." That was
Okay.
kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So you start to see that, especially in some of these united orders where things start to become very successful, and the natural tendencies of man start creeping in,
Gotcha.
and it causes problems. And this has been consistent throughout, well, ever since 1831 when they first tried to start
Right.
doing this. It's it's not easy to create a Zion community like Enoch had
Right.
because people are, I mean, basically it comes down to the phrase, it's hard to be a saint when you're not one.
Right.
And so the united orders that we see throughout history have continually had problems because of the foibles of mankind. However, in Orderville's for to not make Orderville seem so bad, one of the main reasons why Orderville failed was because of the Edmunds Tucker Act.
Right.
So, because that disincorporated the church.
Yep.
And all of these saints down here, they had a tannery, a mill, the ranches, all their businesses were essentially turned over to the bishop of the church.
Right.
Now the church is disincorporated. and they immediately go into lawsuits. As we know, the church starts fighting the government till it goes to the Supreme Court. Once the Supreme Court rules that this law is valid, then leaders of the church go down to Orderville and all these other places and say, hurry, get this stuff out of the church's name. They're coming to take it all.
Oh.
And many of the orders are broken up at this point because of the government, because of persecution.
Uh-huh. What about the one in Brigham City? Does that one get
No, the co-op ones seem to last a little longer
is
because
that
they're
is that
still individual owners,
okay. All
right?
right. That was my question there. Why did they not get hit as hard by that? But that makes sense. And I don't know if you happen to have heard it, but I had a really good interview with a guy named Randall Edwards. He's an attorney there
Hmm.
in Salt Lake, and he had talked about polygamy was simply the tool that the government used to beat up the saints, but the real kind of underlying issues isn't polygamy, right? It's actually the fact that the Saints, wherever they went, tended to become a powerhouse, right? Because somehow Joseph was able to move people around. He didn't have to exercise a lot of strong arm tactics to get it done, and that scared the powers that
Oh
be.
yeah,
Because well, how's this guy doing this? It's growing. That's worrisome to power abhors a vacuum, right? And
yeah.
so you got this guy here who's able to do all this, and if people aren't reliant upon the government, and the government doesn't feel like it's the supreme law of the land, so to speak, you could see where friction would happen, right? And this
Right.
seems to be the case here, right? If they bust up the orders, right, and if those orders are doing very well, you bust those up, well, you have less power now, and there's
Yep.
more to be had.
I absolutely believe that that was the main motivation behind the Edmunds Tucker Act. Polygamy was the abhorrent thing for the culture, but
Right.
as we've learned with government, you know, one hand does this while the other hand's over here doing this.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
it's the real thing. It's the thing they don't want people to think about. Because if you have 150 or so United Orders that not all successful as Orderville or Brigham City, but they're still growing.
Right.
Now you're creating this powerhouse that you talk about. I mean, the kingdom of God is growing, not just in saints coming to Utah, but also monetary means and manufacturing capacity, and they're selling to the pioneers that are going to California. They're growing their economy independent of Babylon, and
Yeah.
Babylon doesn't like that.
Well, not only that, Babylon wants to get its hands on the land and the minerals that are in
Right.
Utah, right?
Yep.
We
Yep.
we we tend to think, and there I want to be clear, there was a period here where there weren't that wasn't happening. But as soon as minerals are discovered, it's not very long. I want to say it's right around the 1870s, I think, when you start seeing outside, companies coming in going, we want to mine those mountains, right?
Right.
And just like today, if you want to get something done in Washington, you don't go to your congressman. You find a lobbyist to go get that stuff done for you. And
Right.
and so that's hugely important to keep in mind here on why they failed, right? Again, because I would think, right, that at some point communication gets out. So if Brigham City's struggling with something, maybe Orderville's doing it really well, and vice versa, right? And so I would imagine that a lot of those issues that we saw would start to get leveled out, right? Everybody would
Right.
start just taking and borrowing from other orders, which in my opinion was the genius of letting them just kind of go and grow on their own, because you could
Right.
experiment a little bit and see what works and what doesn't, and then out of that I think you would have saw kind of an equalization begin to happen between all of them, right?
Yep.
But when you start threatening the existing power structure, that's where it becomes a problem.
Right. And you see this happening, just this very thing you're describing with Erastus Snow, whose brother's running Brigham City, and he starts making suggestions to Orderville to make it a little less communal.
Right.
And because they're beginning to learn how this process works. And we can go on and speculate all we want if the government hadn't come in and broken up what was happening, because we could be in a totally different place today.
Well, Dave, that's funny you bring that up. So I just did some on the fly research real quick.
Hmm.
You know what $70,000 equated to in, we'll just say 1872? $1.8 million dollars.
Ooh,
That's the equivalent of $70,000 in 1872. 1 million, almost 2 million bucks, right? That's not bad.
pretty good
That's not
for
bad.
80
And
families.
yeah, for 80 families that had started out with 20,000, I don't know what that would have been, but
It was about a third, right?
right.
Or a quarter
Yeah, that would have been $520,000. That 20,000 that they started with. So they more than doubled their money,
in four
right?
years.
In 4 years, right?
Yeah. I mean,
That's
it was growth.
yep, absolutely.
And and this leads me to something that I was thinking about in relation to, because this kind of ends the history of United Orders, right? The
Right,
law of consecration carries on in the temple, but after the Edmunds-Tucker Act destroys a lot of these communities, now the United Orders virtually end in the church.
right.
But I was thinking about this earlier. If you really want to understand fundamentalists and why we hold so tightly to some things, study the 1880s. What
And
was happening? It's the golden age for many of us. This was when the United Order was actually being lived, plural marriage was being lived, the temples were being done correctly. The preaching was happening, and the whole gospel was being lived. President John Taylor was doing a fantastic job. He had been, the Council of 50 was in operation, and he was anointed king and priest, or prophet and priest and king, I think it was, over the kingdom. And you have the closest thing we've seen nearest to us of the church and kingdom doing what it's supposed to do. And so that gets carried on now. Things take a turn, as we know, in 1890. And all of a sudden now starts the downfall. The government starts getting involved in the church. Church leaders start making concessions. And this is, obviously a very anti-LDS perspective, but this is the one I grew up with. And now we start to see the downfall of the church in relation to righteous living of the principles as contained in the scriptures. And so Orderville becomes legendary in some senses, because
right.
it was like, oh, this was the United Order lived properly. And I even heard a note, and I don't have any documentation, but it's just interesting that once Orderville falls, some of the people who loved that way of living, they really loved it, that were doing it, had their hearts in the right place, I assume. They went down to Mexico and tried to start the same thing. I heard that, or ran across that in one of my notes. And so
Interesting.
I thought that's interesting because they're holding to it too.
Yeah,
And you have these men who were raised in this society. John Y. Barlow's born in 1877.
right.
Joseph Musser and the Woolies and, you know, Benjamin F. Johnson for the Labaronites. And you can go through all the different groups. These men were raised in this society. And then the church falls and they try to hold tight to the principles and carry that on and teach their children, which
Right.
is our fathers. And we're holding to this thing that was so powerful in the 1880s and carried now over several generations, which is why in fundamentalist names or understandings, law of consecration is almost synonymous with the United Order,
Yeah. Yep.
because we just say, oh, it was done. We know it was done.
Right.
And this is the right way to do it. And it's going to vary based on where your fathers were from. Some were from Brigham City, some were from Orderville or knew of it. They're going to have different ideas, but there's something that could be learned through the practical application and living, which is what we were just talking about. If we could do this, we would learn what things work. Now, down in Colorado City, they had the UEP. They tried to do this again. The UEP had its problems, but for a lot of people who had their hearts in the right place, they said it was a beautiful system. Now, I don't think it went far enough to preserve property rights, as we've seen the outcome from.
Right.
So we can learn from that a little bit. But then we come down to our day. So a lot of communal type living things in today's day would not really be considered legal by
Right.
the US government for tax purposes. How do you tax when somebody's giving eggs and getting, something? There's no transfer of money through the system, so there's nothing there to be taxed, and you're going to get into trouble for tax fraud, like some have. So it would be a little hard in today's world. You'd almost have to do a co-op
Right.
type thing if you could do it, which is what I mean. The Davis County Co-op, that's what they are,
Right.
and many of the other fundamentalist groups that have entertained some sort of united order in one form or another. In essentially, they try to get as close as they can to the communal living, but it's really a group of brethren and sisters working together in a co-op.
Can
So
I ask you a question about
go
just
ahead.
just real quick? And if you're not comfortable answering, you don't have to. But I'm just curious. We talk about kind of, and I'm gonna say it here. I don't know if it's the right way to say it. We have kind of the co-op model, and then we have kind of the communal living part, right? Do you think those two are mutually exclusive, or do you think those two can coexist simultaneously in the same system?
I think they can. And I think that, just again, Book of David here, I think that that's probably the best that we could do.
Okay.
Because, like we said before, the United Order and Order Bill, I'm uncomfortable with the rights of the fathers being trampled on in
Right.
that instance.
Right.
They called themselves the communal family, but I like my time with my kids, and I think
Yeah.
there's value because my belief is the Lord brought them into my family for a purpose.
Absolutely.
And if I turn over my rights to the bishop, that's just putting a lot on the bishop.
Yeah.
Now, this does bring to mind a quote from the prophet Joseph that might be applicable to read. This is in Teaching the Prophet Joseph, page 23. And Edward Partridge is having a question here about how this is supposed to work. And we've heard this quote lots of times, but it's just an interesting way to consider it. He says this on page 23. The fact is this: a man is bound by the law of the church to consecrate to the bishop before he can be considered a legal heir to the kingdom of Zion, and this too without constraint. And unless he does this, he cannot be acknowledged before the Lord on the church book. So this is very, very important. But he says the matter of consecration must be done by the mutual consent of both parties. For to give the bishop power to say how much every man shall have, and he be obliged to comply with the bishop's judgment, is giving the bishop more power than a king has. And upon the other hand, to let every man say how much he needs, and the bishop be obliged to comply with his judgment, is to throw Zion into confusion and to make a slave of the bishop. The fact is, there must be a balance or equilibrium of power between the bishop and the people, and thus harmony and goodwill will be preserved among you.
So
So,
yeah, Joseph's definitely saying
nailed it.
gotta be in balance on this, right?
Right.
Too far one way or another, you're gonna have issues.
Right. And so, in the case of Orderville, I mean, without diving into all the journals, it seems to be fairly successful. Personally, I would be more comfortable where the bishop was held in check, the people were held in check, and all this for the purpose of taking care of the poor and building up the kingdom as we make in our covenants and creating or establishing Zion, where
Absolutely.
we are of one heart, one soul, one mind. And this that we and so now we're in this really good place. It's a perfect segue to talk about why this is important. And this is probably going to be the shortest part
Okay.
because it's pretty obvious at this point.
Right.
We've gone through this history. We can say, oh, I see that there's value in this.
Right.
But how do we do this today? Because, are those of us in the different churches or branches of the restoration, are we required to look to our leaders and say, well, I'll just do my best until you organize an order for me to live in?
Right.
But those of us who've been through the endowment, haven't we made a covenant to do this that we
Absolutely.
read?
Absolutely.
So how do we do this? And this is the question I just keep asking myself. How do we do this? Now, let's talk about the temple. because
Okay.
there's another important aspect in the temple that is mentioned. And I know there's lots of things in the temple we're not supposed to reveal, but there's a great deal that we can,
I
that we're
agree.
not under covenant to. Most of the most of the ceremonies that I have read, with exception, I don't have the current church one, but I don't think this phrase is in it. But in most of the fundamentalist ones, because they try to harken back to an earlier time, there's a certain phrase in relation to the law of consecration that sets it apart from the other laws in the temple.
Okay.
So the Lord tells the messenger, go down to the man Adam and administer to him the law of consecration in connection with the law of
Hmm.
sacrifice and the law of the gospel.
Right.
No other law is made in connection with another law.
Right.
That tells us something, as I see it.
Yeah.
So what does that tell us? And I read that one time when we were doing some work for someone, and I just thought about that. And this idea popped into my head, and you can tell me if I'm totally crazy. During the law of sacrifice, we sacrifice all that isn't worthy of the Lord.
Hmm.
And through faithful living of the Lord's commandments, we sanctify that which is worthy of him and then consecrate it to him for the building of the kingdom and the establishment of Zion. Now
And
we have a way to do this.
okay. Parse that out a little bit.
Okay.
I'm slow. Forgive me.
No, you're good. This is good because so I'm thinking about it. Okay, so I take my properties. Now I can give my surplus to the bishop. If I'm not using it, hey, maybe somebody else should. That's great.
Right.
Now I take what I have and I say, I'm going to take what I have and I'm going to cut off the junk. Lord doesn't want the garbage parts, right?
Right.
It's like throughout the scriptures, sacrifice your best lamb,
Right.
sacrifice the first fruits. So let's get rid of the stuff that's no good. In other words, take our talents and multiply them.
Right.
Do the best we can with what we have. And if it doesn't serve us, we can sacrifice that off. And I'm not saying this is the whole meaning of the law of sacrifice, because you already talked about this. But in relation to the law of consecration, this seems to make the most sense to me. Sacrifice what isn't worthy of the Lord, then live righteously. The
Right.
law of the gospel says that you will live all the commandments of the Lord. Live the law of the gospel. Start to sanctify that which you have decided is worthy of the Lord. And then once you feel that it's at the place, you recognize that it's his, you consecrate it to him for the building up of the kingdom.
Mm.
There's a very, standardized path that you can walk down to bring forth fruits worthy of the Lord. We
And
recognize that everything's his, but in more of a crude way, the Lord doesn't want our junk,
right.
you know? And so now we can turn this internally. What do we do
Yeah.
with ourselves? Do
Yeah.
we not want to cut the bad parts of us off,
Right.
live the gospel, and then consecrate ourselves, our time, talents, and means? That's more than our property. That's us.
Our best parts. Right.
Right, our
Our
best parts.
the parts that we wanted to keep, that we wanted to refine, that we wanted to grow and
Right.
magnify. That's what we give to the Lord.
And we say, take my talents and use them for good.
Right.
Don't take my bad habits. Take my talents. I'm going to deal with those. Take my talents and let's go do this. Now, what is this? And I keep thinking about this and I go, because what is the Lord trying to do? What's he trying to do with us, with the whole temple and everything, if it's not to teach us how to become like him?
Yep. Yep.
And this is what he does.
I think this is so important for that reason that you just mentioned. And this is my own thought. So again, this time it's the second book of Dave, page one. So take it
There
with a
you
great big grain of salt. But I have often looked at the temple, right? If we look at what Joseph Smith is trying to do, he doesn't seem to be too worried about just meeting houses, right? That's not on his radar. He is aiming at something entirely different. He's aiming at communities and at temples. Those are it. Why do those two go together? And I've thought about this a lot. I think making and living those covenants is kind of like getting your citizenship so that you can live in Zion, right? I don't think you could live a consecrated life in Zion without going through the temple first, right? If 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 we can make that leap that Joseph isn't I'm going to say something here that also irritates some people. To me, Mormonism is the first successful counterculture in the United States. It is more than just a religion, right? Um, this is a group of people who are saying we are going to live differently. And this is what Joseph is pushing, right? This is his vision that was given to him by the Lord is that we're going to build Zion. We are going for a community. And just like every other kingdom, right, has its own economic policy, its own economics uh, um, system. This is the Lord's, right? This is the Lord's program. And so going through the temple and making these covenants is super important because I do think it's your passport or your citizenship card to get into Zion. It's
Yeah.
the Ellis Island on which you put your feet to immigrate to Zion.
Yeah. And and to go along with that, the reason why is because Zion is the pure in heart.
Yeah,
And can we truly learn how to do that unless we're willing to go through this process?
right.
This sacrifice and law of the gospel and consecrating ourselves, if we're not willing to go through this, then we're not prepared.
Yeah,
Now, I want to harken back to the story you told about Baal.
yeah,
It's in contrast to this. Instead of sacrificing the parts that aren't usable, let's sacrifice the parts that are.
right,
It's in contrast here.
right. Yep.
And the Lord is trying to say, no, I want the best parts of you. Because, and this goes almost without saying, the living of the fullness of the gospel, so the temple as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
all the covenants that we make, what they're trying to do is help us shed off the parts of us that are not worthy, help us to walk in the way that we should. Because
Right.
we're not going to be comfortable. The celestial kingdom is governed by the principle of charity, which I like to define as this: service in the spirit of love.
Yeah.
That's the motivating factor behind the gods.
Yep.
And living these laws correctly helps us get our motivations in the right place. They help us shed greed. They help us shed dishonesty. They help us shed all the foibles of the flesh to learn to think and act and be motivated by the things that God is motivated by, the way that God thinks and the way that the reasons that he acts the way he does. And I don't think that could be understated. This isn't just a simple ritual we go through just to make ourselves feel good. There's
Right.
purpose here. And, and so we just bring it back to the law of consecration. What could the Lord be trying to teach us in this order of having all things in common? This order of turning over our properties to the Lord? If it isn't to help prepare us for those who are faithful to stand in council with our brethren and create an earth and recognize its purpose.
Right.
It's not for our own gain. We have all the gold and all the riches of the world in our hands as faithful kings and priests on the other side, but we recognize those things have a purpose because we learned it when we were here.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. I if and this is just my opinion because I do want to talk about that part there a little bit. So often, I think we have this idea of consecration and united order. I shouldn't say often. I've heard some people say that, well, we're all just going to be poor together and then we'll have no rich or no poor among us. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, right? I don't think that the saints were meant to live in hovels their whole lives and that was going to be God's glory, right? I really do think that when he says we want no poor among us, there's a standard there, right? And he wants to bring people up to that. Um, there's a weird religious um, pride that goes in sometimes to poverty, right? And I want to say this: there is no sin in being poor. I've been probably never wealthy, but I've done well and I've also done really poorly, right? '08 to '12 was rough on my profession, brother, right? There wasn't a lot of building going on in those days. Um
Yeah.
and so I'm not criticizing anybody for that, but you shouldn't use that to justify staying there either, right?
Right.
There and look, the more you can bless the more you can get, the more you can bless others with. And I think that's important to keep in mind here, right? Um, Getting gain for the sake of getting gain, I think is a bad thing, right?
Yep.
Getting gain so you can bless others with it, I think is what the Lord is aiming for. But mankind has a way of once he gets some money, all of a sudden, those things start to change a little bit in that guy, right? I mean, all of a sudden, that game theory takes over and it becomes a zero-sum game. Knowing who the Lord is, like you were saying, and this is what I want to get back to. This idea that there's not enough to go around. No, I'm a believer that wealth can be created, right? And if
Hmm.
mankind can do it, the Lord can do it through his system, right? And so there's plenty to go around. It's just how we're going to use it. And I think and I loved what you said there, right? That those covenants that we take in the temple, especially with consecration, is about getting ourselves in a place to where we could part with that so that the Lord can work with it and bless the lives of others.
Yeah. And, we could even go into that a little bit with the poverty, because there are some people that are poor due to circumstance, and there are some
Right.
people that are poor due to bad habits, or
Right.
maybe they have an addiction problem, or there could be a number of reasons.
Yep.
So, what is our responsibility in relation to those people? Is it not to help them? If the Lord has blessed us, aren't we supposed to help them the way that He would help them? And
Absolutely.
that's not just giving them $100 bill,
No.
like you do with it, but say, hey, what can I do to help you see a different picture?
Yeah.
If some of these people, they just need to recognize that they have value,
Yeah.
and that their efforts have value. And I recognize this is hard for people when they've lived a life that maybe they're starting out as a young person, and it's hard to get a job and it's hard to get money, and no one will, extend out an offer to help teach them how to be productive. And so, as business owners and as leaders in the communities, we have a responsibility to look to those people and say, what can I do to help them? Not just like the old phrase, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a night. Teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for a lifetime. So, how do we teach our young people how to fish, how to work, how to build the kingdom, and yet teach them that the most important part is giving,
Yeah.
not just receiving? And this is how we start to build a Zion community based on these principles of consecration, because we recognize that the things the Lord has given us, they serve a purpose for his people, not for our own ego.
Yeah.
And
That,
I think that's what we're trying to learn.
I think you're 100% correct. I as I've looked over, different people and their struggles and that sort of thing, you are 100% correct. There is a lot of reasons for poverty, right? For the guy who's working hard and he just can't catch a break, you know what? Maybe that dude just needs a little bit of cash to get him over the hump, right? He's already got good habits. If a dude's got good habits, at some point, things are going to break his way, right?
That's right.
The guy who doesn't have good habits, but yet is still trying, but just keeps to continually shoot himself in the foot, that's the guy where you got to kind of maybe wrap your arm around him a little bit and be like, okay, so here's what we need to do, right? We need to maybe shift things a little bit in our perspective and get you going on the right path. And so as we talk about consecration, I think there's a lot that we can do there with that, right? The Lord doesn't put a limit on what it is we can consecrate, right? It's quite the opposite. He expects everything, right? At the end of the
Yeah.
day,
Yep.
that's what he wants. And why is it that's what he wants? Because he wants, as you put it, to work with the best parts of us, right? And there's going to be guys, David, that you can reach that I just can't, right? It's just a
Right.
matter of personality, and that's just the way it's going to be. And so all of us are needed in this.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say is that before I do that, I'm going to share a story. I have not shared this publicly, I don't think. And I'm going to here on this one. After a couple years after my dad died, I must have been pushing 15, 16 at this point. We were poor as a family. I mean, dirt poor. We went from my dad doing really well while he was alive, business owner, had several shops across the Pacific Northwest. Um, he passes away. We have to sell those off, and then we're pretty poor at that point. The old man was really good at making money, but he wasn't so good about saving and, life insurance and those sorts of things, right? And so we get really poor. And I'd come home one day from school, and my mom was sitting at the table, and she was crying, and I saw her put an envelope, I mean, a letter back in an envelope. And I asked her, "Hey, mom, what's going on? What's happening here?" Now, at this point, my mom's working three jobs. She has no real, she's got a high school diploma, and that's about it, right? Um, she would work from like 2:30 in the morning to about 8:30 or 9 at a grocery store bakery, getting donuts pushed out, that sort of thing. Then she'd come home. She would sleep for a couple of hours. She'd go to work for an insurance agent as a secretary, do some filing, that sort of thing, until like 4:30 in the afternoon. Then she would immediately go down to the nursing home in town and serve dinner, and then get home by about 7:30, 8 o'clock, go to bed, and be right back up at about midnight to start getting ready for work. And just doing this over and over and over. And I remember I, after she said, "No, I'm fine. I think I'm just tired. I'm going to go to bed." I was, as I'm prone to do, I'm like, "Well, we'll just see about this." So I just kind of moseyed on over the table after she went to bed, and I pulled out um, the letter that she was reading. And what I saw is that she had tried to apply for some food assistance from the government. And the government said, "You know what? You grossed $20 too much, so we can't help you." And in that moment, I remember thinking, one, I'll be damned if I ever go to them and ask them for a thing, right? At 15 years old, I all of a sudden became Rush Limbaugh. And then um I remember thinking there's got to be a better way. There has got to be a better way to do this, right? I saw the system abused. If we're not going to do this, this is the covenants we make. These are the covenants we make. If we're not going to do this, who's going to do it? Right? Because newsflash, the government kind of sucks at doing this. Um,
Yeah.
I feel like that this does belong in the realm of religion. And the reason it belongs in the realm of religion is because we're supposed to love our brothers and sisters that we attend with. And we can make decisions with them that are in their best interest. And we need to get down to brass tacks on that really quickly. And I will say this. I think we need to start looking at consecration again as maybe a viable option again, right? I'm look, I'm not saying rush out and do it, but I think it's worth studying and understanding really well, and then figure out where you want to take it from there.
Oh, I appreciate that story because, and I do want to say there's a lot of people who struggle and a lot of people who do receive assistance from the government that seems to be their only option.
Yep.
Because let's face it, the government's created a monopoly on charities.
Yep.
And but it doesn't have to be so.
Yeah.
So let's just hypothetically talk about how could an order like this get started today
Yeah.
that was hard to abuse?
Yeah.
So I'll just take myself. If I go through the temple and I make this covenant that I'm going to consecrate all that I have, and that means I'm going to look out for the poor. That means I'm going to, you know, consecrate my surplus to the bishop. However, if I have a bishop, if I don't, well then I'm going to do my best to recognize the purpose for which all this things that the Lord has blessed me, what that purpose is. And I'm going along doing the best I can, but I'm just me, just one guy.
Right.
Well, then I run into a faithful brother who says, "Hey, I'm doing the same thing. Do you know that, in synergy, 2 plus 2 doesn't always equal 4? It
Right.
actually starts to increase. What if we joined our things together and we started to be able to bless more than twice as much as we could before?" And then another brother comes and says, "Hey, I like what you guys are doing. It has the right spirit. Let's come together. By the way, here's a community. We have a bishop. We could do this even a little more organized." Now, doesn't it make more sense to have something come from a grassroots kind of a place rather than a top down, you know, I want you guys to do this? And then I'm not saying anything bad about leadership, but sometimes this happens and it
Right.
works very well for the leadership because they get control of a lot of money,
Yep.
but if you have people who are 100% committed in every way and they're coming together for the right motivations and the right reasons, so much could be blessed because you would look for ways to bless people instead of saying, like the churches say now because of the government, well, we don't have to really do that because the government does that. And I know the LDS church actually does a pretty good job for the most
Yep.
part, helping people. And so not everybody's this way, but I know a lot of people, single people, not in a community who say, well, I don't really need to do that. It's like, well, you're starving, go to the center down the road. Now you don't
Right.
want to fall into this with the church and say, "Hey, I'm not supposed to take care of you. That's the bishop's job." You
Right.
say, "No, you have a responsibility as an elder in the church to help people." And you will see this if you watch communities and you watch people's motivations and see what they actually do, you will see this manifest. I've seen this in one instance that I'll bring up. I know a man who has a successful business, and some of the employees and the young men of the community are needing to build houses, and he has a successful business and he will fund them building their house,
Hmm.
and they will do all the work themselves, or them and all their buddies and whoever else of the community that has time to come and help will do as much of the labor for free, and his business will provide all the money to buy all the materials. He essentially owns the house legally until it's done, passes off final inspection. They get a person to come out and do the inspection, see what it's worth, and they take that and get a note from the bank, and he sells the house to them for the cost of the material. Now, that's somebody, and he's not gaining anything. Like, he's not saying, "I'm going to take a cut or a profit." He's just saying, "Hey, you work for me, you're a good employee, or you're a young man in the community, I want to help. Let me help you do this." And I can think of several people right now that do this,
Right.
even in some of the communities I've visited. And this helps a young person be able to get a house for sometimes up to half its estimated value
Right.
because somebody's helping. And this isn't demanded. He's not a bishop. He's not a president. He's not the top dog. He's just somebody who the Lord has blessed and he wants to bless others. To
Right.
me, that's the spirit of the law of consecration. What can we do to help people? Not give them a handout, help them
Right.
do right with their life and get them on a good, firm footing so that moving forward, then they will be in a place to bless others down the road. And you can start growing this community in a way that otherwise would be very difficult for one person to do by themselves. But when a collection comes together, a lot of good can be done.
I agree. I agree. And that's, the guy you just described is the guy that's consecrated in heart, right? Look, the Savior was very clear. Where where your heart is, where your treasure is there, or where your heart is where your treasure's at, right?
Right.
And again, if you approach it from game theory, right, kind of a zero sum game, um, you're going to lack in this all the time, right? And it's how you're going to view those resources. Do you view those resources as the means to an end? And look, I've known a lot of smart businessmen that the money is just how they keep score, right?
Mm.
And are really good about, if they see a need, they'll go help. And I asked one once. He was a developer, and I knew he gave away a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. And you hear things working in the industry, right, about how he's helped out people before. And I asked him, I was like, what motivates you to do that? And in full disclosure, this guy was a Catholic. And he said, well, I just feel like it's my duty. I've been blessed and I want to. I was like, what keeps you going? And he's like, oh, it's just the game. He's like, just the game, right? The money is just how I keep score, right? And sometimes in that score you want to keep all that, right? And I get it. It's your labor. I get it. I'm not a
Yeah.
socialist by any stretch of the imagination, right? But that does not alleviate us of the fact that for many of us we've taken covenants and the Lord is
Yeah.
serious about those things. Um,
Yeah.
just because you're not so serious doesn't mean the Lord was. And
Right.
you better understand that going into it.
Yeah. And you could even bring in an alternate covenant, which is the exact opposite of this, which is what creates the Gadian robbers.
Yeah. Yep.
It's the exact opposite. The covenant that Cain made with the devil completely contradicts the United Order and the law of consecration in every way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you I'm curious. I want to get your thoughts on this. And again, if you don't want to speculate on it, it's fine. And because it'll just be speculation. There's this idea that there's two ideas I've heard predominantly in Mormonism, not just fundamentalism or the LDS Church. It spans the gamut, right? Because I do think if you're going to be a Mormon, the idea of a Zion community is hardwired into you. You're not getting away from it. It's there. Do you feel like we need to establish this before the Savior comes, or do you feel like this is something that gets established when he shows up?
I'm a very practical minded thinker. And I say, if we are not living this now, seeing the Savior is not going to make us do it.
I agree.
Like, we've got to develop as much as we can with the experiences we have. We've got to begin to develop the kind of character that loves to live in that kind of society,
Yeah, I agree.
because it is not in our nature to want to share the hard-earned wealth that we have, or however it is. I mean, we've talked about a lot of history. There's a lot of reasons why it failed, but at the end of the day, it's because it's not in our nature to do this. But Enoch did it. Going right back to the beginning, Enoch did it, and he created this Zion society. And it says in chapter 7 of Moses, the Lord was with them. And I have to believe that it's something akin to what the brother of Jared witnessed. I cannot withhold my face from you.
Right.
because their hearts and their characters were in the right place. So there is a case to be made that he will come when we're prepared for him. Now, maybe he comes in destruction. I've noticed one other thing that in relation to this, you see in fourth, the end of third Nephi and fourth Nephi after the Savior leaves the American continent, that the people lived in this Zion for a long time, several generations, if
Right.
I'm not mistaken. And they had the Gadianton robbers amongst them right before. They had all this destruction, and they saw the Savior. They made covenants with him. They heeded his direction, and they begin to live in this kind of society. So I suppose there's a case to be made for either of them to be true. But
Right.
to me, it doesn't change the responsibility we have today.
No.
We already know about it. So if we're waiting for the Savior, then we'll find ourselves in a place not unlike the Jews were waiting for the Messiah, feeling like there's just a lot of things we can't do till he comes. Well, we know about it. What can we do to start implementing Zion? Zion is, like you said, Zion runs in the blood of every morning.
Yep.
We want Zion. Now, we may not understand what all that means, but we are hardwired to seek for it. And it's more than a community, it's more than a city on a hill that's, painted white. This is the condition of their heart. And this selfless love that we were describing before has got to be the motivation behind it because it surpasses wisdom. It gives us the wisdom to know how to bless people in the right way
Right.
and how to take care of our stuff, how to multiply our flocks and our business ventures and we're talking about, at least for us specific, we're talking about building a temple.
Right.
It's going to cost more money than we have. But if the Lord puts things into our hands and we're faithful over a few things, he will multiply it to be faithful over many things. And we'll
Absolutely.
be able to do the work that he asks us to do, just like Joseph was trying to do and did. I mean, he nearly completed the Nauvoo temple by the time of his death.
Right.
And you watch the church do this, and the church had lots of financial troubles till Heber J. Grant came along in reality. But they're constantly trying to do better. And it's not about becoming a trillionaire church,
Right.
but taking care of our responsibilities, learning the lessons, because everything temporal has a spiritual aspect. And I
Absolutely.
think that can't be forgotten.
I think you're right. You know, and I think I honestly think that this idea of consecration goes for America. I think it's super important for America, and I'm gonna tell you why here in a second. I think it goes back farther than Joseph Smith. And do you know who John Winthrop was?
Name sounds familiar, but
Okay.
I don't know.
Winthrop was, by all accounts, a guy who had it pretty good, right? He's living in 17th century England. His dad was an attorney. He became an attorney. Um, Super smart, but he has kind of a religious awakening. And he's one of the guys that would bring settlers over to the Plymouth colony on
Mm,
one of the voyages. I think it's Plymouth. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong on that. But he's one of the guys who leads people across the ocean on a boat. He's on the boat and he wakes up one morning and he's like, I have got to put this people under covenant or we're not going to make it. I mean, just out of the blue, like we've got to
mm,
get them under covenant or we're not going to make it. And I want to read just a portion of this here real quick, if you don't mind, Dave.
sure.
He says, for this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves, our superfluities, for the supplies of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other. Make others' conditions our own. Rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes a commission and community in the work as a member of the same body. So we shall keep the unity of the Spirit of the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God. And here's where it gets interesting. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell amongst us, his own people, and will command a blessing at our hands, or command a blessing upon us in all ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom and power and goodness and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel will dwell amongst us. When 10 of us will be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and a glory that men shall say of succeeding generations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. Beautiful promises,
Oh, yeah.
but there's a warning at the end. And I don't think we can just take the good without understanding the warning. And he says this, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon the hill, and the eyes of all people will be upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work which we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his presence from amongst us. We shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of the enemies of God to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. And we shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So Winthrop
Wow.
is really clear, right? We have to embrace each other in this familiar commerce, abridge ourselves of our superfluities for others' necessities. This is a condition, right? And in a weird way, I think Winthrop, through Revelation, tapped into even what was said when Alma was baptizing at the waters of Mormon, right? It's got
Right.
that ring to it too. It's got a little bit of consecration going on, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah.
And then a warning. You're not going to do this. A story and a byword will be throughout the world. We'll shame God. So
Yeah.
understand that even before the temple covenants were restored, this is very closely associated with this land. And there are conditions with which we have to keep this if we want to prosper in the land.
Yeah. And to show you the alternate that can happen, because he lays out the warning, right?
Yeah.
But if we go back to Enoch, what happens? Because it says in chapter 7 that the armies of the land went in battle against them. And according to apocryphal stories, Enoch stands on the mountain in front of his city, between his city and the army, and calls upon the Lord, and all the lions in the wilderness roar at once. And the armies are like, no, he ain't doing this.
Right.
Oh, and then they turn around and more or less defend the city and tell other people, don't go up to this city, something's happening. That was because of their faithful living.
Yep.
They did this. So based on this letter of John Winthrop, it the first thing that strikes my mind is we're not in such an unsimilar position today.
No.
We have the information.
Yes.
If we don't move forward, we will end up like the warning that he gives there at the end,
Yeah.
because we have the information. Where there's great knowledge given, there's great responsibility required. And it's on us.
Yeah, and there may not be a better people to do it now, right? Because not only do we have the covenant in place, we also have history that we can look back on and say what worked, what didn't, what do we like, what do we don't. And I do feel like God's given us some latitude with this, right? I think,
Yeah.
look, a lot when it comes to histories that deal with mortals, I say the absence of evidence is not evidence itself. But when we're dealing with the Lord, I tend to say the absence of evidence kind of gives you some latitude, right? And I think that's by design. And I think that there are different flavors of this thing, so to speak, right? And I think that we're uniquely poised today to look at this. And
Yeah.
look, I don't care who someone voted for. but I got news for people. It's not going to fix everything, right? Um,
No.
stop looking to Washington to solve these things, right? This I hate to break it to us all, but this stuff, this is kind of our realm. This is where we should
Yeah.
be operating. And I think we have a responsibility to do so, or at least
Yeah.
look at it and really make sure that our hearts are consecrated as well.
Yeah. And to go back to that letter
Yeah,
and the ties that it has to the Old Testament and the nation of Israel and all the things the Lord was always trying to do throughout the scriptures was create a people that recognized that he was their God and he recognized them as his people.
yeah,
He has set forth the commandments, he set forth the way, he's given us all the tools. What are we waiting for?
yeah, yeah. And the promises were amazing that were made in there, right? What was the promises? He'll dwell with us, right?
Yeah.
And where we try, what's the point of Zion? Well, it's a place where God can come to, right? It's a place where Jesus can come and talk to his people.
Right.
Um, right down to when Winthrop says, when we do this, one of our men shall, or 10 of our men shall be able to withstand 1,000 of our enemies, right? Very much
Mm,
as I, no one's going to want to come up and war against Zion. We're told that in the scriptures. Those don't go there. There's no hope of looting there, right?
yep.
Um, I really do feel like that's the key, right? In all this. And this leads me to something else. And I was wondering if we could talk about this just for a minute. I guess at my heart, I would be considered more of an independent fundamentalist, right? Now, there are people that I go to church with. And I remember I had to make this decision pretty quickly. Which was, well, yeah, I could probably, me and my family, we could probably have a really Zion type family. But that's not Zion, right? You need to be able to work with other people to create Zion. And this idea of just being a lone ranger, Mormon, so to speak, I think you kind of miss the mark a little bit, right? I think you have to be willing to work with other people to bring this about because you can't do it by yourself with just your family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Eh,
I think it's PNC 42 again, where it talks about the gifts and talents that are given to the saints for
Right?
the benefit of the whole. And different people have different gifts and talents, and we actually need each other
Yeah.
in ways that we cannot comprehend. Now, I understand why the separations exist. I grew up in this. I was marinated in the history my whole life. I know why.
Right.
But there's still a part of me that wishes that we could actually get past, because really most of our disagreements honestly come from leadership things.
Mm-hmm.
But if the people could come together united in the gospel, and this is just a big dream, I guess, then we could start to see some changes. But for now, it is hard to be a lone ranger. That I, I'm interested in listening to you because I really don't know what that's like in a way. I'm my own person and I have my own feelings and they don't necessarily agree with everybody I know, but I've always had at least, my cousins and my uncles around.
Right.
I've always had a little bit of a community and that community is beginning to grow. But what really opened my eyes on my personal journey was as we begin to associate with other people and see that there are gifts and talents that people outside of my direct group or community possess that we desperately need. And the Lord is a uniter. He's not
Yes.
a divider. Although he lets people have their choice. And Lucifer has done a fantastic job at telling people that it's just too hard to work
Right.
together because he knows power that could come from a Zion community would shake the foundation of the earth and perhaps bring about the second coming.
Absolutely. And look, where I go to church at, I I'm richly blessed to just be here, right? I want to get that out of the way. Um, but you need that community, right? And I think you can't really be fully consecrated without it, right? I think you just need other people. You need to be able to work with other people.
Right.
And the other thing is by working with other people, that's going to shave off some of your rough edges, right? Because look, I'm not going to lie to you, it's hard to work with other people, right?
Right.
It's hard to work with other people at work, right? Um but there is value in that, Dave, because
Yeah.
I can't be the most pleasant guy to be around all the time. I understand that. I'm self-aware enough to be like, whew, there's a reason both my wives will make sainthood, and I'll probably
Yeah.
be struggling just a little bit because the Lord's gonna be like, who is your husband? No,
Yeah.
just go on through. You're fine. Um, but but no, we do. We need each other. We need to be able to work together and figure this all out. But I don't think that means that we're gonna always agree on everything, right?
Right. That's right.
And so often I think because we look at certain scriptures like the one we just read in DNC where what's Zion? It's people of one heart and one mind. I don't necessarily think that means, oh, you agree on everything. I tend to think, no, that's a people that probably have that common goal, right? That's probably where that one heart and one mind thing come in. But there's probably some differences on how we think we should get there. And can you disagree agreeably enough to hang together to work through that and be
Yeah.
able to be united that long, right? I think Joseph
Yeah.
Smith had a quote about that, if I'm not mistaken, where he said something
Yeah.
to the effect of, "Why haven't we realized all of our?" And I'm really paraphrasing here because I'm trying to remember it all, but basically something to the effect of, "We haven't achieved all of our blessings because we haven't been able to hang out with each other long enough to get them." Right? We always just
Yeah.
fly apart.
Yeah. And there's something to consider because, where plural marriage, from our experience, plural marriage will tend to, if there's all the qualifications, if lived properly, if you have the right motivation and all the things, but if you try to do it right, it perfects us individually as a family.
Yes.
Whereas living law of consecration in united order perfects us as a community because it's not easier. I
Right.
wouldn't tell someone who has one wife, oh, go get another one because it's so much easier to live with two than one. It's
Right.
it's no, it's just not.
Right.
But if you want your sharp edges to be knocked off, you're gonna need to go through some things. And
Yep.
those things will give us experience to do us good, like the Revelation says to Joseph, these things will be for thy experience. And they begin to shape us into the sort of people. If we don't ever put ourselves, or in modern vernacular, if we never get vulnerable enough
Right.
with each other, we'll probably never expose the hidden parts that need to be changed.
Yep.
And these higher laws, if you will, they're not higher because they're higher up on the ladder. They're higher because they strike more intimately at our problems. They're
Yeah.
more refining in nature.
Yep.
And it's not easier. It's not easy to do the things the Lord has done, even though, or said to do, even though it might be simple. He can say it simply, but it's not necessarily easier. But the rewards and the fruits, like you talk to one person that has lived plural marriage and lived it faithfully and ask them, if you went back to the beginning, would you do it all over again? They would say every time, absolutely, I do it all over again.
Yeah.
And I think this is the case, like I was reading in with Orderville, some of these people whose motivations were probably in the right place, when the government said they couldn't do it anymore, they went to Mexico and found a place to do it again
Yeah.
because I think their hearts were in the right place. And this story and tales of heroism get passed down through our generations, and we begin to long for the blessings. And yeah, we probably need to go through some of the hard things too. But we're in a place today where there is some aspects of living, even, and I don't want to say we live the United Order like Orderville, but to live the law of consecration as true, we probably need to start assessing some of our incorrect traditions and start dealing with each other because really there's one truth.
Yeah.
We can disagree on our opinions, but there's one truth. And we're probably not going to come to that on our own,
No.
but through experience and respecting each other, learning to turn to the Lord. I mean, you see this case over and over with Joseph in all these revelations, especially around consecration, because there's quite a few of them. You know, I one of these stories, I think when he received section 119, but it might have actually been 42. I think they were having the discussion about this law of consecration I just read, and Joseph kneels down right in front of the brethren and starts asking the Lord, what does this mean? And the faith of the brethren was there, and he receives this revelation right in front of them. Now, there's a person who knew how to get the answer, and he only did that through experience. Now, a lot of it packed into a short time, but he did it. And we could say he was foreordained. We can say he was given the abilities to do the work for his time. We were given the abilities to do the work for our time.
Absolutely.
And the Lord is holding that and saying, please step up to the mark and I will bless you. And I believe it's a promise to each of us, the same as it was for all generations of time.
Right. Even the Savior said, the stuff that you just saw me do, you're going to do more.
Yeah.
You're going to do more. If if the Savior says that to us, I don't think it's fair for us to look at Joseph Smith and go, "We'll never, we can't get there. It's impossible." Right?
No.
The only thing that makes it impossible, I think, is our own weaknesses, and in my case, probably my own laziness. Right? Um, I, there, yeah,
For
no,
me.
absolutely. Is there anything else you want to cover we didn't, Dave?
No, I'm sure in about an hour I'll be like, oh, should have talked about it. Oh, should have talked about it. We've had a great conversation, so I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Perfect. Well, if you think of something, hit me up. This will be released on Saturday, so if we had to hop on tomorrow and add something, let me know. We can do that.
Okay, perfect.
So awesome,
Hey,
dude. You're
thank
the
you.
man. And look, once you've been on once, bud, you can come back on whenever you want. You studying something, and you're like, "Ooh, I want to talk about this." You let me know. We'll get you back on.
You might come to regret that.
I doubt it. I doubt it. I mean,
Hey,
what's better for people than to hang out with two guys named Dave? I mean,
nothing.
nothing.
That's the best.
It's absolutely the best. So
Daves are just good guys.
yes, absolutely. Well, dude, it was fun.
Yep.
All right, hang out
Awesome.
for just five
Thank you.
minutes. All
Okay.
right, bye, everybody.